So for those that don't know me, I'm Sir Jaime von Atzinger. I've been a knight for, I think, 6 years now. Most of that time, I've been in the Barony of the Flame. And before that, I was in Dragon's Mark, both of which are not very heavily populated locations. Relevant to this class because in my local practice pre-pandemic, we averaged 5 to 8 fighters, participants per week, and that was rapier and armored. Post-pandemic, we're averaging 3. That comes with special challenges for learning and for teaching. And when I have reached out to the notable teachers in the kingdom, there's not a lot out there for how do you overcome that specific hurdle. A lot of the people who are very good at this sport are, this is not, so you want to enter an ANS, this is we happy few, how to get better at a small practice.
Apologies.
No problem. So a lot of people get good by being around people who are very good and having a big reservoir of knowledge to draw on. Not all of us are that lucky to have that in our local practice. So I have some hopefully useful tips and tricks and practical advice through lived experience about how to get around some of the particular challenges. So with that, I'm going to start my slideshow so you don't have to look at my face the whole time. As if I can figure out how to do that. Okay. All right, so first of all, the prime resource that you're having to deal with in a small practice is time. What I've found over the years is with fewer people, you get less time actually fighting, mostly because of endurance and cardio. So for instance, if you've got 10 people at your practice, you can fight literally as long as you can keep your breath and you'll have somebody to fight. When you get down to 5 people, 3 people, what happens is you are more or less limited to the endurance training of your lowest common denominator, right? And so you really have to prioritize what you do at a practice to maximize the time that you have. At our practices, we've got 2 hours total to be in our space, knock off 20 minutes for armoring, knock off another 10 minutes for armoring down and loading up. That's not a lot of time to begin with. Plus, you can't fight that whole time unless you're in really, really good shape. And even if you are, again, you have to have a partner who's also in really good shape. So first step is do at home what you can, right? The most basic thing you can do is learn how you move. That's it. For me, Pel work is that. So I know a lot of people use Pel work to learn specific shots, learn specific combos. And personally, I've not found that to be super helpful. What I've found is when I spend a lot of time on the Pel, like I've done this pandemic, as soon as my opponent moves or, you know, as Sir William says, has a say in what's going on the list field, most of that falls apart, right? But what's invaluable for me is learning the mechanics of it. Learning, okay, if I want my sword to be here, how do I need to move my body? How's my weight need to be? Where do my feet need to be? That translates very well. Some of that you can do in drills, right? There's all kinds of resources out there for Pel drills. I've got a link to Duke Uhler's Pel video, you know, things like the 1 through 6 drill, or Duke Dietrich has a bunch of things on specific shots that you can learn on drills. That's the time to learn muscle memory. The other thing, which I don't think gets talked about enough, is being in good shape doesn't just help with your cardio and your strength, which are both important. It helps with learning how to make your body do what you want it to do. And some of this I know because I actually didn't get in shape until I was trying to become a knight. So like early 30s, late 20s, which is kind of embarrassingly long into my life to be fitness oriented. But I was kind of astounded at the difference in coordination and control that I had when I was working out regularly and appropriately compared to before. I've always been strong. I've always been in a fairly good shape, but the difference was startling. And that's something that you really need to do beyond just your local practice time. So another thing you can do is avail yourself of the wealth of knowledge that's out there. We live in the digital age, the information age, and there are hours upon hours upon hours of video that you can watch. There are classes that you can take without ever having to, fit it into your schedule. There are lots of resources, and I will give you some at the end that I've found helpful, especially ones that are mid-realm specific. But there's more out there than I know about. There's more out there than you could possibly watch. And what that'll get you is some of what being in a deep practice can get you, which is that earned experience, right? So we've never had a person from our local group win a crown. So we don't have any royal peers that are local, that are active. But I have access to a lot of royal peers and their wisdom secondhand. Another thing that I found really, really helpful is going over fight video of people that I know that I'm going to fight, or people that I've had trouble with in the past. So this is specific, like I know that I'm going to have to fight Sir Kellic in the next crown, and I am not really sure what to do about that, right? So you can go and you can find video of Sir Kellic fighting a dozen different people, and you can watch that. Again, kind of like Poe work, I get the value of it. For me personally, it helps to kind of put together what they're doing. So that kind of gives me a roadmap of things to try or things to keep in mind while I'm fighting them. My brain's not that encyclopedic. I'm not one that can study fight video later and say, oh, this is the step that they do right before they do this move. Still hugely helpful. Another thing that I found extremely helpful is that there are several groups out there that are doing analysis of fighting. I think it's Medieval Fight Review is perhaps the best known and perhaps the best done, where they'll bring in guests and they'll break down a fight piece by piece. And one of the things that's really helpful about that is that they will take away some of the guesswork, right? So they'll say, how did Duke X land this shot? Well, 2 steps before that, they did X, Y, and Z so that they knew this opening was going to be there, right? Now, that's the kind of thing that even at a high level, sometimes watching a fight in process or even watching fight video, you don't necessarily catch unless you've practiced it a lot and you're really good at that fighting review. And in the same vein, there are groups where you can submit videos of your own fighting and have a group of people critique it. So again, if you're, I'm in a location that doesn't have any royal peers. If you're in a place that doesn't have fighting peers, that can be hugely valuable. While you're learning these skills yourself, to have somebody who's a new set of eyes, who's a little more experienced, and who practices this kind of exercise, looking at you specifically and giving you specific feedback, can be super valuable. So some of that you can do on your own, right? So when you're home, it's not a practice night. If you've been recording at your local practice, it's a great time to look over that video, to post that video to a local group to get their feedback, to post that video to one of the pages I'm talking about and get their feedback. If you're the kind of person who writes down advice that they've been given, very good to go through that before a practice. So I did that for a while when I was an unbelt, and I would find that if I waited until the night before a tournament or a TOC, I would have pages and pages of advice to go through, and it was much like trying to handle it the day of, right? It's too much information to deal with all in one sitting. In fact, that's kind of why you write it down, so that you don't have to digest it all at once. And that would be a good time, pick a night pick a day of the week where you go through and you say, okay, this has ended up being helpful. This has ended up not being helpful. For a while, I was even writing notes after practices. I tried this, I tried this, I tried this. This worked, this didn't work. And it can be helpful twofold. It can be helpful because it helps kind of in your process of figuring out what works and what doesn't work, but it also kind of keeps your mind on the mental game of fighting, on letting your subconscious work through the different aspects and keeping it top of mind even when you're not on the list field. Much like some of the other things, visualization, I try hard at, but I'm not very good at it. There are some of the top people in our game talk about spending time imagining fights as how they got to be in that top tier of fighter. Something I work on, but it's definitely something you need to do not in the moment, not on the list field, and not when you're in armor. So when you actually get to practice, there's some things that you need to focus on because they're the things that you can't do when you don't have an opponent in front of you. So if you haven't watched it, everyone should go watch Train Like You Mean It, put on by Sir William, who does a great breakdown of the kinds of things that you should be doing in practice. I'm not going to rehash much of what he said, but you should all at least watch part 1. It's on YouTube on the Rome channel. So part of training is working on specific techniques, right? A lot of times in practice I'm at, we do a lot of sparring, but we don't do a lot of training. Training should be focused, and it should be focused on the kinds of things you can't learn on a pill. Right? Partnered slow work is critical, but I think often misunderstood. A lot of times, even in my own training, when people have said slow work, what they mean is we'll do a slow motion fight and maybe work on a specific technique, maybe we're just warming up. That is okay for trying techniques out that are unusual, gives you time to process, gives you a lot of good muscle feedback on, okay, I'm out of balance at this point of the swing, but all of that is different at speed. One of the reasons I don't like it is that a lot of my technique is based on subtlety and misdirection, and you can't do that, right? You can't do hesitation fakes, you can't do pump fakes, you can't do a lot of stuff. And when I'm throwing my shots full speed, I can't do a lot of the recoveries. I can't do a lot of the redirects to defense that I can do at slow speed. So what I like to do for slow work is break it down into its constituent parts, right? So if I'm working on, say, teaching a person a leg shot, we will set one person up frozen and then go as slow as the attacker can go to work on technique and balance and all that. I'm sure that there's a place for the quarter speed fight in the process of learning to fight, but I prefer more we call it frozen man type drills, where one person is completely still and the other person is going very slow. Similarly, as I mentioned, when I work on technique on my PEL, it tends to fall apart in person. So finding a partner and saying, I am working on this specific thing, you can say, block it this way, or you can say, try to block it, but this is what I'm doing. We're going to do it 5 times in a row until I get it. We're going to talk about it, but making it a specific training tool. And everybody knows some drills, right? We're going to go through some drills later, but specific fun activities that work on skills that isn't just let's swing sticks at each other until one of us gets tired. Highly useful. All right. So difference between sparring and training. Sparring is full speed, or at least mostly full speed, and it's not scripted. Right. So if you have telling somebody I'm going to throw this shot, you react this way, or even I'm going to throw this shot, you react however you want. That is a training aspect. Sparring requires unpredictability. And one of the great things about our sport is that we do more sparring than pretty much any combat sport that I've ever heard of. And that is a benefit of wearing good protective gear. And I think it's also why we get, I'm going to say higher quality. We get people who can cross sports. So we get people who can go into steel fighting, we get people who can go into foam fighting and do well, because most of our time is spent in this kind of real world sparring scenario. And this is the time to learn, what is it about your shot that's falling apart when you're doing it against somebody who can move versus on pel. This is where you can learn, how do I work with my opponent to make them do things? How do I work against my opponent to keep them from doing things? The kind of thing that you can't do when you don't have somebody across from you. The last two are things that should happen in every practice, but they're a little bit more esoteric. So you can work on intensity without a partner, but it's a lot harder. It's one of those things that I think we should be training when we're off the list, but you really need to be training it at least once a practice, specifically with a partner. In part because I think it's where a lot of our mid-level fighters stall out. So we need to be talking to each other about the mental side of the game. We need to be training the mental side of the game. And part of that is that at least once a practice, we need to take off all the stops, stop saying, okay, I'm working on my offside headshot, so I'm not going to try to win a fight unless it is the offside headshot. We need at least some time where we're letting our battle computer, letting our subconscious, letting our fighter brain, whatever you want to call it, free, so that we can integrate all of these things that we've been working on this whole practice and see what comes out. And the other thing that you need is you need to be social, right? Like, one of the main reasons I do this is that there are all these people that I love and appreciate and like to spend time with. So I get to come and hang out with them. Our local Eric de Rotnaken calls it the schmooze to schmite ratio. So pay attention. It is important to be social, but again, time in armor on the list is your most valuable commodity for practicing. What I like to do is, if I'm going to be social, I'm going to do it while I'm armoring, right? If we're going to be talking between bouts, let's be sipping on water, recovering, and let's be talking about fighting while we're doing it, right? There's time before, there's time after to be social. Let's take as much of the time in the practice to be practicing. So I was not entirely sure that I should put this on, because I'm not sure that this is specific to small practices, except that, again, you've got to be economical, right? Especially if you're in a place where there are limited coaches who are really good at coaching, you got to kind of work on coaching yourself. And these are really the keys to that. All right. So what I find is the most detrimental to people who know kind of the direction they want to go but don't know how to get there, that they often have too broad of a goal. This partly comes from TOCs, where people come up and ask them what they're working on, and they'll say, footwork. I'm working on offense. I'm working on defense. And that's not super helpful. It can work as a tell your coach that and they'll know more or less what to look at. But if it's just you really need to have something that you can measure, something that you can specifically take steps to address, right? So if I am myself working on moving better, I'll choose one thing or two things to work on that practice, right? I'll say, okay, I need to work on lateral movements when I'm being chased, right? That's something that you can say, okay, I did that well, I didn't do that well, right? If I'm just working on moving my feet, maybe I moved my feet really well for 3 out of my 10 bouts, that doesn't give me much to come back to and say, okay, this is what I did wrong. This is what I need to do better. So some of that ends up being more difficult when you've got broader goals, right? So like if you're working on staying engaged in the fight for longer, that you have to break that down into multi-step goals. And then again, this is something that you can think about outside of practice. Break it down, maybe write it down and say, okay, at this practice, I'm going to work on staying in range with my eyes open while they attack so that I can counterattack, right? So that's, again, a very specific part of a multi-step goal. Think about what it would look like to do what you're doing, what you want to do well. That can be hard sometimes. Again, if you're not in a place that you've got good examples, if you need to look that up, again, outside of practice, or ask somebody, or think about somebody who does what you want to do well. If you're not sure what success looks like, there's almost no way to get there. I mean, you can trial and error it, but it took us decades to get this sport where it is. And a lot of that was because we didn't have good examples. We got dozens of good examples now. And that's one of those things that you can reach out to people that you respect if you're having trouble, right? You can say, okay, I really want to work on offhand single saber fighting, right? And there's not much video out there of people who fight offhand single saber. Who should I talk to? Most of us really, and when I say us, most of the chivalry really like talking about fighting. Most of us have spent a lot of time training. We know generally who's good at what. Another pet peeve of mine, but also important if you're dealing with people who are not used to having to coach, is that if you are going to talk to your partner about what happened in a fight, it can be really good to let them know that beforehand. A lot of times I'll be doing pickups and we'll have a fight. At the end of it, somebody will ask, how are my feet during that? Or do you have any advice for me? I can usually pick back and find something to talk about, but it's much, much better if at the beginning of that fight you say, I'm working on X. Would you please pay attention to that so that we can talk about it afterwards? And again, if you're dealing with people who aren't as experienced, who don't have a lot of practice breaking down fights, that can be absolutely vital, right? It's too much to ask them to think about what you're doing in the fight, think about what they're doing in the fight, and then actually fight all at the same time. All right, so the purpose of all of our training should be to understand the foundations of fighting more so than the practicality of it. And again, this is not really limited to a small practice framework. This is how you get good at anything, really. So you need to know why you're doing the things you're doing. Then you got to learn how to do it in all these different situations, and then you got to learn when to do it, right? And this is one of those helmet time, opponent time, and talking about it afterwards kinds of things, right? You can win 5 out of 6 bouts at a practice and not get better, or you can talk about why this didn't work, why I wasn't able to do what I wanted here, or why it worked this time but not that time, after losing 6 out of 6 bouts, and get better. All right, so I've talked a little bit about if you're in a place that doesn't have a good culture of coaching. We are changing that as a kingdom. I know that in my local areas, both Flame and Dragon's Mark, there's been a big cultural shift in this. It used to be that we were very good at training new people, and then we kind of left people to the wolves until they got decent, and then they were picked up again because they had potential. Now we're pretty good about keeping up with them throughout and supporting those who are plateauing, because that's a very common thing, really, for anybody learning skills. Taking this idea pretty heavily from Sir William in his class, and that's that everybody's got something to teach. I love it when I get feedback in practice. I love it when I get feedback from people who have been fighting for a year, partly because I can't see what is happening in the fight, and partly because newer people have perspective that is very different from those of us who've been doing it a long time. He's not as active anymore, but Sir Ingram used to say, we invite people to our sport and they win fights for about 6 months, and then we say, no, that's not how you do it. And then we proceed to beat them senseless for 3 years until they learn to do it our way. And there's something to that, right? That these things work because we think they work, and that's the culture, and we make that the way you do things. Back on a little bit of a tangent, but the important parts are, you got to work on that how, when, why, for all the fights, right? Even if you know exactly what happened, talking about it helps your opponent, and it can bring up things that you didn't realize that were happening. Again, taken completely from Sir William, you got to keep it short, though. We easily end up talking well past the capacity to listen to our advice, and then we lose 80% of its usefulness. Sir William says 5-minute cap on talking. I say 2 minute. I mean, I'm willing to meet in the middle there, but make a comment and then do it, right? If you've got an observation, say, your feet were in the wrong place. They were here. They should have been there. Done. You don't need to talk about how you know that. You don't need to go on a 10-minute, description of all the things that led up to that. There can be time for that later. Keep it fresh, keep it simple, and work on it right there in the moment. A lot of times we give advice after the fact, and then we just kind of have to store it away and hope that we remember it the next time we have an opportunity to work on it. Much better, especially again in small practices. You got a little bit more leeway in that you can control the culture, right? If there's 3 of you, you can just say, hey, we have plenty of time to fight. We're all going to be exhausted long before this practice ends. Some of this is going to be coaching time. Stop. What did you do there? Walk me through it. Let's go slow. Let's do all these things the right way so that we all get better. And as part of that, we need to teach and learn fight analysis, right? So one of the drills that you can do is to have 2 people fight and have a third person describe what happened leading up to the killing blow. For those of us who are experienced, it can be fairly easy. For people who are very new, it can be exceedingly challenging. But if you don't have that level of understanding of what's happening, then you're not going to get those foundational how, when, whys. And you're not going to be able to be a coach to the people around you. So being able to break things down at speed, vital. If people are willing to be coaches, again, just having somebody from the outside say, I know you thought you were in range when you threw this shot, but you really weren't. Again, invaluable. And as part of that, most of us have high quality cameras in our pockets all the time. And getting video of yourself is easily the best tool for a small practice. Lets you, 1, see what's really happening, because video does not lie. And 2, it helps with a bunch of these other parts, right? So you can then work on fight analysis. You can work on specifics and looking at, okay, was that really a success? Was I really doing what I thought I was doing? And it lets you think about it between practices. Side note there, though, for those who are trying to be competitive on a kingdom level, I do recommend sharing these to private pages, because there are people out there who will study fight video of opponents so that they can do better in tourneys. So unless you're putting it in a public space for public comment, you can make a private YouTube channel or private Facebook page very easily and share it with just the people who need to see it. All right, so there aren't that many advantages to having a small practice. And here's some of the disadvantages that you probably already know about. First one is what I call genetic drift. So that is you have a technique or a culture that crops up that spreads to a local practice that maybe is highly effective, but often is highly effective for that practice and not as effective when you leave that practice. Top of my head, I'm thinking when I joined the Flame, we were absolutely core fighters. We had several fighters who were very good at getting in close. And when I started to travel, I realized that that was not very common in the kingdom. And I learned why, right? Because it works well for the people who like that fight. But the people who don't like that fight never let you get that close, right? And so I had this whole set of skills that I was rarely ever able to use because we didn't have to practice closing. We all liked fighting there. Not a bad thing to have those skills, but it's very important to be aware of this is a cultural phenomenon of this area, right? Another thing that happens is that you get people who are having a lot of success in local practices and then go to tournaments and do horribly. A lot of that has to do with if you fight the same 5 people every week, you're going to learn their moves, you're going to learn their patterns, you're going to learn their thinking styles, and you're going to do better against them, right? They're going to have patterns that you can exploit. You're going to have patterns. You end up fighting 3 or 4 layers deep in the, okay, well, usually they do this, but they know that I know that, so then I'm in a, which is not as applicable when you have never met your opponent. We can talk a little bit later about how to overcome that. But it's helpful to be aware that if you leave and you don't have the success that you're used to, that's a perfectly normal thing. And I believe that it happens less in larger practices because you have more variety. You've got more depth to the experience already. The other thing I found is that people are not as comfortable with the whole process of tourneys, right? If you are very familiar with the, again, 3 to 5 fighters that you're fighting with, and all of a sudden you've never met anybody that you're fighting, if you're fighting people who are echelons above what you're used to fighting in your local practice, it can be jarring. And that in itself can make you seem less skilled than you are. So actually, I can talk a little bit about counters to these while we're on this slide. So the counter to fighting the same people and learning their tactics is to fight them with an unfamiliar style. Either they pick up a style that they're not used to, or you pick up a style that you're not used to. And that will 100% change the fight enough that even if you know what they reacted to, let's say with sword and shield, they're not going to react the same way if you have a long sword. They're not going to react the same way if you're fighting 2-stick. And it helps to train those in the moment decision trees and observation skills that we can let go by the wayside if we're very familiar with our opponents. Same thing for patterns, except that if you have a set of go-to shots, if you have a bread and butter style, specifically and consciously changing that can be super helpful. So if you have this is my setup for my leg shot and I'm 80% successful with it, consciously say, this practice, I'm not going to throw that. Break your own patterns and see how that affects the people that you're fighting. For comfort level, I'm again stealing this idea from somebody else, but I think we should have more formal tourney-like events at practices. I believe Flaming Griffin has a monthly tourney at practice, including honors, the whole script, brackets, all of the extra accoutrement, so that people who don't make it to tourneys as often are more comfortable with what's happening when they finally get there. My last point on this slide is that one of the common things that happens in practices is also you have really good techniques that stop working because people know you and they know it's coming. And that doesn't mean it's a bad technique, right? Just because the people you fight can shut it down and see it coming, you should absolutely still have it in your back pocket for people who don't know you. And it can be hard to remember which ones are solid techniques in an inappropriate place and which ones are techniques that don't work anywhere. But you can write it down. When you're doing those fight to win fights, that's the time to pull out some of these moves that have previously been successful that you haven't used for a while. See if they still work. Hopefully people have forgotten it a little bit. Even if they block it, it's good to keep that muscle memory sharp for when you're fighting people that don't see it coming. So this is what I struggled with when I was an unbelt. When is it appropriate for you to travel to other practices specifically? So I think everybody should travel to any event that they can make it to. Traveling is absolutely vital to getting better. And it's really the only 100% cure to all of those habits and downsides that I was just talking about, is going to places where there are people who, you've never experienced, styles you've never had to fight, and people who are far more experienced than you are. If you're going to travel to other people's practices, though, I do think that there is a minimum skill set that you should hit before it makes a lot of sense. So for instance, you need to know what works for you. So even if you don't have a lot of success in fights, so maybe you're not winning many of your bouts, you need to know, okay, I am the kind of fighter who does X, right? I like to be at this range. This is the way I use my feet. This is the weapons platform that I prefer. If you're not to that point yet, then a lot of the advice you're going to get is going to be not as useful. Again, in a similar vein, you need to know how it is that you receive information the best. Are you a person who needs a demonstrator? Are you a person who can just talk about it? Do you need to watch somebody do it to you or to somebody else while you're looking over the shoulder? Again, you're going to try to maximize the benefit for the cost that you're putting out there of traveling to somebody else's practice. And in a similar vein, you need to be able to speak the same language as the people who are going to be training you, right? You need to know what kind of terms to use. You need to know a broad understanding of when they say A-frame, what do they mean? When they say sword foot or goofy foot, what do they mean? And you need to be able to be conscious of what's happening in the fight. So kind of like we're talking about, where if you can't understand why somebody is winning or losing, it's really hard to absorb what's happening to you. Now, good thing is, it doesn't take long to get to this level of fluency in our sport. I think that I know I was personally discouraged from traveling to other fight practices for far longer than I would encourage now. I think that for most folks, if you've been fighting for a year and a half, 2 years, you have a lot to learn, a lot to gain from traveling to other pools. And then the best way to absorb something is to teach it. So absolutely have the intention of coming back to your, again, smaller pool and bringing with it that new skill set, that new knowledge, in part because it'll help you absorb it in the moment better, but also because if your opponents are getting better, you will get better. That's really the only way. All right, I've got a few example drills to do with small groups. Blatantly stealing most of these from other people. Again, I got a lot of good resources that I'll have up at the end, and I'll make this slideshow available so that people can go back and look through these. I have found working on melees and practices is difficult with a small group. Partly that's cultural. I live in an area that's very much tourney based in our training, with households that occasionally work on melee as a household, but it's not something that happens very often in practices. So I found these drills that are more set up like short games to be pretty helpful. So the top row is you can do it with 3 or more people. 2 versus 1 progression is essentially just you have a team that is overmatched and they fight this person, and then they move to the next person, and then they move to the next person. If you've got 3 people, then you've got to kind of break it up a little bit. But if you've got 4 people, you can cycle in the 2 people who are not on the team to be the next in line to fight. That's really good for working on situational awareness and organizing on an opponent as opposed to just staying together. Captain Roulette is really any of these or just matched melees where you take turns being the person who's coming up with the strategy and calling the shots. Another one of those really helpful for people who haven't had much experience so that you can talk about why did that work? Why did that not work? And really give people a chance to build some of that confidence of command. Breakthrough is where you change the victory conditions. So this is another one that works really well with 3 people. So instead of who's left standing at the end, the victory condition is if the one can get past an arbitrary line. And so that's really good for working on movement and, again, that combat awareness. And also the idea that laying stick on your opponent is not always the goal in melees, which is a mental shift for a lot of people. If you've got more people at your disposal, you can do more interesting things. So I really like, I'm calling it overmatched. It's got another name somewhere. So that is, you line up in as even as you can get teams. And then the first person, oh, I screwed it up. That's right over. Okay, so this one is, as soon as you die, you hustle back around to the other side. So it's a resurrection battle where essentially the number on each side changes during the battle. All right, and so the good thing about this one is that, let's say you've got 3 knights on this side and 3 unbelts on this side. It overbalances but then corrects itself pretty easily. Really good with a limited front battle, and really good for you have to reassess every time that you switch sides based on who you're up against, instead of just saying, okay, they've got spears, we've got shields, this is what's happening. A version of that is the Y bridge, which His Excellency Eric came up with, which is a limited front battle where you've got 3 entrances to a shared middle space. And it's the same idea that if you die on bridge A, you move yourself to bridge B. If you die on bridge B, move yourself to bridge C. And again, it's all about awareness, knowing when to press your own advantage, knowing when to be a little more defensive. The Red Rover is the one I first started talking about, where it's not resurrection, but the first person to die switches sides to the other. And that's another one that rebalances itself fairly easily. And you end up getting more skilled but smaller teams against less skilled but larger teams, which helps out both. Some of these we talked about, the drills to work on singles skills. I am a huge fan of counted blows or timed matches. I think it helps to work on intensity and defense and really paying attention to follow through as opposed to just beating the other person in stick tag. So counted blows would be, we're going to go till you hit me 3 times, doesn't matter where you hit me. Time matches would be, we're going to fight for a minute, call out the blows or don't. But after a minute, we'll call it. The timed matches, the way we do them, nobody wins. You're not really keeping track because that would take an outside marshal, and we usually don't care as much about that. Counted blows, if you want to keep track, you can keep track. We talked some about the slow work frozen man dichotomy, so I won't go into that. The next two, I think, are extremely useful for the mid-range fighter. So the all-out attack is essentially the attacker has no limits, but the defender has 1 to 3 shots that they can throw. Right. So the idea is that the attacker should be able to overcome the defender every time. The defender gets some shots because it is very easy to get lazy if you're the attacker and attack, and leave yourself open to a counterattack. So the defender's got to have some kind of a let's keep you honest mechanic. The reverse of that is that the attacker has only got 3 shots and the defender can't throw anything. And that works on planning out your attack and working on manipulating your opponent. In my experience, we almost always do the bear pit rather than any of those, which is just the winner stays in until they get too tired to move and then they're knocked out. I'm not opposed to that as a endurance building and experience gaining drill, as long as you're talking about it after, as long as you're working on something specific and make it a training thing rather than just a meet and beat. We're not going to go into all these. These are resources to get fight videos, resources for the video fight reviews, classes, all kinds of things. Everybody should watch Count Williams' Train Like You Mean It. Everybody should watch Sir Gunner's The Victorious Mind. I've got both of those on there. The Train Like You Mean It is in the mid-realm classes. The Victorious Mind is on YouTube. Not everybody's on Facebook, but there are a bunch of good groups for exactly what we're talking about. I've linked some of them here, and again, I'll leave this in the RUM page for other people to come back to. These are all hyperlinked, so you should be able to get to them. And that is all I've got in terms of formal presentation. I would love to chat a bit and answer questions.
This was a great talk. Thank you. And I especially liked the reminder that when you are working at your local practice, your practice becomes a fishbowl. You get really, really good at the people you see every week. Even when they are exceptional fighters and you become an exceptional fighter, you and they learn all the ins and outs of each other, and that creates a myopic vision for the rest of the people you might see at a tournament or if you go to another practice. So keeping that in mind, I think, is really critical, both the downside and the upside of being in that position. So thank you.
I know I found it fairly discouraging when I was an up and coming unbelt to, have great success against the knights in my area. And then I would go to tourneys and not win a fight against a knight.
Yeah, thank you for the class, because I'm not Shiv, I'm going rapier path, but these are the same things we can use. And our fight practice goes anywhere from 3 to 12. So some weeks are great, and other weeks, what do you do with 3 people and one of them is new?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of the same drills work. I was a fencer for 10 years before I was ever put on armor. Fighting is fighting. The principles transcend.
Yeah, I mean, I can see using every single one of these things. So
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'm up in Toledo, so I get up to Detroit a fair amount. So, but it's still a small. The funny thing is, that's really still been a small practice. There's still been only about 4 or 5 of us fighting, and so it still has some of that same feature of, well, okay, I've fought Rangvalder every week now for the last lost every time, but but you still have an idea of how you should do and how you kind of pre-program everything, and then like, well, how do you break out of that, and how do you do that? What's interesting for me is I go back and forth between that and a practice where we have 3 or 4, 2 of which are new, and then trying to bring some of that back, I think, is a really important point.
And training is a very different skill, right? Not everybody's a good teacher, but you can train training. It's something that we all have to work on.
I also wanted to say thank you for the reminder that we shouldn't be talking at practice, or we can talk, but it should not be a talking practice. It's a practicing practice.
I'm also one who thinks that we should have more social stuff in general, but again, that might be local culture and also pandemic culture.
Yeah. It's, I think, really critical for us to get the chance to have the community, but along with the community of the people I get to put on armor and fight against, I also need to take that as the opportunity to fight them. So both let's go fight and let's talk through what it means to be doing these fights. I am prone to talking too much, so I may have to buy myself a timer.
Yeah. Well, one thing I miss is just the fact that with pandemic, we've, in addition to just so much smaller or so much less frequent practicing on a lot of scales, but also just not even going out with each other socially after practice and going, because that's, for me, that's the social part is, okay, so we'll go someplace for a beverage afterwards, for some food afterwards for an hour, and then you can get some of that talking that you doesn't then mess up your time at your fighting.
It's a really fair point. Yeah. And there's not a good answer to that.
Yeah, unfortunately, until we get to a point where things are a lot lower levels and a lot more stable, then we're just kind of stuck.
Hey, so I've been fighting for about 8 months, and so I have a lot of questions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you had mentioned like not traveling until you're like a year and a half, 2 years. So at 8 months for me, is that not a good idea to be traveling to other practices yet?
Depends on you entirely. Are you at a place where you feel like any fighter could give you advice and you know what they were talking about?
No, I have a hard time absorbing. Like they throw my local practice, we usually have like 2 to 3 heavy fighters on average.
Right.
Most everybody else is doing rapier. And I have, the occasional Duke that comes out, the occasional Knight that shows up, and they throw a lot of stuff at you and they say, well, as long as you absorb like 10% of what we're saying, then you're doing good. And so I'm constantly just like full, just trying to like absorb what I can. So I'm still struggling, I'm still just trying to learn everything. Everyone has been fighting longer than I have. And, I also just stepped up as the Baron for our local barony too. So everybody wants to show me how to fight,
Right.
and it's very challenging at times, taking advice from different people, and my head is just always full, and I just feel like I'm swimming all the time,
So two points about that, and I think we're going to run close to being out of time in this room, so we can continue this conversation on another platform if you'd like. It's never a bad thing to travel, right? You're never going to be at a detriment if you take an evening and go somewhere new. You won't get as much out of it at this point as you will when you're further down the path. And as part of that, I think it should be said more that as a student, it is perfectly acceptable to say, I am full. I'm going to write down what I've been told already, but if you keep talking, you're wasting both of our time. Because a lot of these bits of advice are useful that you're going to get, but it would be time better spent working on what you're already have in your cup, if that makes sense, right? So rather than getting 10 pieces of advice, remembering 2 of them, getting 2 pieces of advice and reinforcing that 2 more times, vastly more helpful.
I understand. Thank you.